What is the real connection between all the Evil Dead films? Why do the first and second movies seem to tell the same story? Is the 2013 film a remake, or does it take place within the same universe? How many Necronomicons are there? And how does everything ultimately connect to Evil Dead Rise and Evil Dead Burn? These are all questions that came to mind after I finished watching the latest film. As it turns out, the story of Evil Dead has never been as easy to understand as it may seem, but it is not completely impossible to put in order either. This franchise has never been overly concerned with maintaining a clean and straightforward continuity. Some films change details from the previous one, others reinterpret scenes we have already seen, and in certain cases, it is not even clear whether we are watching a sequel, a remake, or a parallel story. However, behind all those contradictions and changes, there is one consistent idea. Evil always finds a way to return. The characters change, the book changes its appearance, and the rules vary slightly depending on the film, but the source of the nightmare is almost always the same. Someone finds an iteration of the Necronomicon, ignores every warning, and ends up reading aloud the words that should never have been spoken by human lips. So in this video, we are going to put the entire story of the Evil Dead films in order. From the origins of the Necronomicon and Ash Williams' arrival at the cabin, to Mia Allen, the Bixler family, and the search for the Kandarian Dagger in Evil Dead Burn. Obviously, there will be spoilers for absolutely every film, including the most recent one, as well as the Ash vs. Evil Dead series, because it provides important context. Now, without anything else to add, let us begin. Long before Ash Williams ever set foot inside that cabin, the world was already connected to creatures and dimensions that humanity could barely comprehend. Some accounts speak of the Dark Ones, ancient entities capable of existing between different dimensions. These beings were connected to the creation of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, also known as the Naturum de Monto, or the Book of the Dead. Its pages contain prophecies and rituals capable of opening portals, summoning spirits, and awakening entities that remain dormant beyond our world. One of those entities is the Kandarian Demon. This demon normally has no physical body of its own. It manifests as an invisible force that moves through the environment, enters homes, and searches for people it can possess. It also appears to be accompanied by numerous lesser spirits connected to one another, almost as though they were all part of the same hive mind. When one of those spirits enters a human body, the victim becomes a Deadite. Although they are often described as zombies, Deadites function in a very different way. They are not corpses that simply return to life in order to feed. They are bodies possessed by entities that also retain the memories of their victims. That is why they can speak, recognize other people, and use private information to emotionally manipulate the survivors. Deadites do not simply want to kill you. Before doing so, they want to confuse you, humiliate you, and make you believe that the person you knew is still somewhere inside that body. Now, one of the greatest sources of confusion has been the appearance of the Necronomicon. The book from the original films does not look much like the one in Evil Dead from 2013, and neither of them resembles the volume that appears in Evil Dead Rise. For years, this could be understood as nothing more than a design change. However, the more recent films allow us to consider the possibility that several different volumes of the Book of the Dead exist. Army of Darkness had already shown 3 books when Ash had to retrieve the real Necronomicon, although at the time, the other 2 appeared to be simple traps. The most widely accepted explanation is that the first is connected to Ash Williams, Raymond Knowby, and the original trilogy. The second would be the volume found in the cabin in Evil Dead from 2013, with a cover apparently made from different pieces of stitched human skin. The third would be the book from Evil Dead Rise, made with a darker cover, root-like structures, and long teeth that keep its pages closed. Each book contains pages with different spells and incantations, and each can manifest evil in slightly different ways, but they all appear to be connected to the same Kandarian force. The history of the first volume takes us to Professor Raymond Knowby. Knowby was an archaeologist and researcher who found the Necronomicon among ruins connected to the ancient Castle Kandar. Fascinated by what he had discovered, he took the book to an isolated cabin in Michigan so he could study it without interruption. There he began translating its pages and recording his discoveries on several audio tapes. The problem was that Nobi did not fully understand what he was reading. While reciting one of the passages, he awakened the Kandarian Demon. As a result, the evil force reached the cabin and possessed his wife, Henrietta. Nobi managed to lock her inside the cellar, but he did not have the courage to destroy her body. He even began to believe that he could save her by transferring the entity into someone else. To attempt this, he deceived one of his students, Tanya, and brought her to the cabin. However, the ritual failed and the young woman died. Nobi realized too late that he was trying to control something far beyond his understanding. Henrietta remained imprisoned beneath the floor, and the professor eventually disappeared, leaving behind the book, his notes, and the recordings in which he had spoken the incantations. Shortly afterwards, 5 young people arrived at that same cabin. They were Ash Williams, his girlfriend Linda, his sister Cheryl, his friend Scotty, and Shelley, Scotty's girlfriend. None of them knew what had happened to the Nobi family. To them, it was simply a trip to spend a few days away from the city. But from the moment they crossed the bridge, the evil presence began to make itself known, and Cheryl was the first to sense it. While she was drawing, an unknown force took control of her hand and forced her to create the image of a deformed face. Later, the group went down into the cellar and found the Necronomicon alongside the professor's tape recorder. Scotty played one of the tapes, and Nobi's voice once again recited the passages from the book. Although none of them read directly from the Necronomicon, the recording was enough. The Kandarian Demon awakened once again and traveled through the forest until it reached the cabin. Cheryl was lured outside and brutally attacked by the possessed trees. By the time she managed to return, she had already been infected by the evil. The young woman became a Deadite and attacked the others, forcing them to lock her in the cellar. From that point onwards, the night became a massacre. Shelley was also possessed, and Scotty had to kill her with an axe. Shortly afterwards, he attempted to escape through the forest, but returned gravely injured and eventually died. Linda was the next to transform. The demon used her face and voice to torment Ash, forcing him to confront the body of the person he loved. At this point, Ash was not yet the exaggerated and self-assured hero everyone remembers. He was simply a terrified young man, unable to accept that his friends were no longer human. But little by little, he began to understand that he could not save them. In the end, Ash discovered that the fire was affecting the book. So he took the Necronomicon and threw it into the fireplace. As its pages began to burn, the possessed bodies decomposed. The sun rose, and for a few moments it appeared that the nightmare was over. Ash left the cabin, but then the invisible force emerged from the forest and launched itself directly at him. The film ends with Ash turning around and screaming just before he is struck. And this is where one of the greatest sources of confusion in the entire franchise begins. Evil Dead 2 opens by showing Ash and Linda arriving at the cabin once again. However, this time they are alone. Cheryl, Scotty, and Shelley do not appear, and Ash seems to discover the book for the first time. This led many people to believe that Evil Dead 2 was a remake and that the events of the first film were no longer canon. But technically, that is not the case. The explanation is connected to the rights for the first film. Sam Raimi could not freely reuse all the original footage, so he had to recreate the key events through a much shorter introduction. In other words, the opening minutes of Evil Dead 2 do not replace the entire first film. They function as a modified recap so that the audience could understand the situation without having to see all the characters again. So the correct way to understand the story is fairly simple. The Evil Dead, meaning the first film, happens in its entirety, including the deaths of Ash's friends. Evil Dead 2 truly begins after the final attack, when the Kandarian force strikes Ash and hurls him through the forest. Everything before that is an altered recap. In fact, the franchise itself has played with the idea that Ash's memories have become confused by trauma. In Ash vs. Evil Dead, for example, he remembers different versions of how he found the book and constantly confuses the details of that night. So even within the story, we can interpret the contradictions as the distorted memories of a man who was possessed, traveled through time, and watched all his friends being torn apart. With that made clear, let us return to the story of the second film. After being struck by the demon, Ash is briefly possessed. However, when the sun rises, the entity loses control and he returns to normal. but the cabin will not allow him to escape. The bridge remains destroyed, and the evil continues using Linda's corpse to torment him. Her severed head returns, bites Ash's hand, and spreads the possession into that part of his body. Then one of the most important sequences in the saga takes place. The hand begins attacking Ash as though it has a will of its own. After fighting it throughout the cabin, Ash eventually cuts it off with a chainsaw. Later, he modifies that chainsaw so that it can be attached to the stump of his hand. This is how the most recognizable version of the character is born. Ash Williams, carrying a sawn-off shotgun in one hand and a chainsaw in the other. While all of this is happening, Annie Noby, the professor's daughter, is returning from an excavation. She and her colleague Ed Getley have found several pages that were torn from the Necronomicon. Because the bridge is destroyed, they receive help from two local residents, Jake and Bobby Joe, who lead them to the cabin along an alternative route. When they arrive, they find blood everywhere, widespread destruction, and an Ash who appears completely insane. At first, they believe he murdered everyone, but Raymond Noby's recordings reveal what actually happened. They also discover that Henrietta remains locked in the cellar. The possession begins spreading again. Ed transforms into a Deadite, Bobby Joe dies in the forest, and Jake is dragged into the cellar, where Henrietta tears him apart. Ash is also possessed again, but he manages to regain control when he sees the necklace that belonged to Linda. The memory of his girlfriend allows him to fight the entity from within and free himself. With Annie's help in the missing pages, Ash finally destroys Henrietta. Annie then recites an incantation capable of opening a portal and sending the Kandarian Demon into another dimension. However, the rift begins absorbing everything around it. The evil is pulled inside, but so are Ash, his shotgun, his car, and the chainsaw. Ash disappears from 1982 and falls several centuries into the past. This is where Evil Dead 2 ends and Army of Darkness begins. Although, once again, the two films do not connect in a completely seamless way. At the end of Evil Dead 2, the Knights watch Ash kill a flying demon and begin hailing him as the hero from the prophecy. But Army of Darkness reinterprets his arrival once again. In this version, Ash is captured because they believe he belongs to an enemy army. They take away his weapons, place him in chains, and bring him to a castle, where he is thrown into a pit occupied by Deadites. Ash manages to defeat them, recover his weapons, and force everyone to recognize that he is no ordinary prisoner. The kingdom's wise men believe he is the chosen one, a prophesied man who would fall from the sky and save humanity from the army of the dead. However, Ash does not actually want to save anyone. All he wants is to return to his own time. And to do that, he needs to recover the Necronomicon, because the book contains the incantation that can open another portal. Because of this, Ash accepts the mission. But while preparing for it, he also creates a mechanical hand and begins a relationship with Sheila, a young woman from the kingdom. During his journey, he crosses an enchanted forest and eventually takes shelter inside a windmill. There, he is attacked by miniature versions of himself until one of them grows inside his body and becomes a complete duplicate. This evil doppelganger later becomes known as Evil Ash. The real Ash manages to defeat him, cuts him into pieces, and buries him. But this will not be enough to keep him dead. Shortly afterwards, he reaches the cemetery where the Necronomicon is located. 3 books appear, and Ash has to identify the correct one. He eventually succeeds, but forgets the exact words he was supposed to say before touching it. Instead of admitting his mistake, he attempts to improvise the incantation. And as expected, everything goes wrong. The army of the dead awakens, Evil Ash returns, and he takes control of the skeletons and Deadites that begin rising from their graves. Ash returns to the castle with the book, but initially refuses to help. He believes that he has already fulfilled his side of the agreement and demands to be sent home. However, Sheila is captured and transformed into a Deadite. This is when Ash realizes that much of what is happening is his fault, so he decides to stay and prepare the kingdom's defenses. Using his modern knowledge, he creates explosives, modifies his car into a mobile fortress, and trains the medieval warriors to face Evil Ash's army. In the end, the living manage to defeat the dead. Ash destroys his evil double, rescues Sheila, and receives a potion that will make him sleep long enough for him to awaken back in his own time. There are two different endings here. In the best-known ending, Ash drinks the correct amount of the potion, returns to the present, and goes back to working at the shop where he had once been an ordinary employee. Suddenly, a Deadite appears, and he kills her easily, proving that he is no longer the same terrified young man we saw in the first film. He is now a hero who enjoys confronting evil. But the original ending was much darker. In that version, Ash miscounted the number of drops he was supposed to take and slept for far too long. When he awoke, the world had been completely destroyed and humanity appeared to have vanished. In this ending, Ash awakens in a post-apocalyptic future. Although that ending was not retained as the official conclusion of Army of Darkness, the idea would return many years later. Even though the films left Ash working in the present once again, his story did not end there. Approximately 30 years later, Ash was still living alone and avoiding all responsibility. He no longer resembled the hero who had saved a kingdom, and possibly the world, but instead looked like an aging man who worked in another shop and lived in a trailer. However, one night, he made exactly the same mistake that had ruined his life decades earlier. While under the influence of drugs, he opened the Necronomicon and read one of its passages to impress a woman. In doing so, he released the Kandarian Demon once again. As a result, the evil began spreading once more, and Ash ended up accompanied by two new characters, Pablo, who saw him as a hero, and Kelly, who wanted to avenge the death of her family. Although he tried to escape, Ash once again accepted his role as the Chosen One. He also met Ruby, a woman who claimed to be searching for the Necronomicon in order to stop the evil. However, it was later revealed that she was one of the Dark Ones and had played a direct role in the history of the book. Her demonic children were written into its pages, and her true objective was to regain control of those creatures. This became one of the main storylines of Ash vs. Evil Dead. Across the 3 seasons, Ash, Pablo, and Kelly faced demons, time travel, and new versions of Ruby. They even attempted to change the past, although history eventually corrected itself, and the main events at the cabin took place once again. Ash also discovered that he had a daughter named Brandy, born from a relationship he had many years earlier. For the first time, this gave him a personal reason to stop running away and confront evil in a more responsible way. In the end, a gigantic creature known as Kandar the Destroyer emerged in the present and triggered a battle that marked the beginning of a worldwide apocalypse. Ash decided to face it alone, so that Pablo, Kelly, and Brandy could escape. After temporarily defeating the creature, Ash lost consciousness. When he awoke, many years had passed. The world had been destroyed, civilization had changed, and a woman explained that he was still needed to continue the war. In this way, the series brought back the idea from the alternate ending of Army of Darkness, showing that no matter how much Ash tried to avoid it, his destiny always led him towards one final battle in a post-apocalyptic future. Meanwhile, as Ash's story continued in the series, the films began exploring other manifestations of the evil caused by the Necronomicon, and so in 2013, the franchise returned with a new Evil Dead film. At first glance, this new installment could appear to be a remake because it repeated several elements from the original. Once again, there was a group of young people, an isolated cabin, a cellar, and a Book of the Dead. But the characters and circumstances were completely different. Here, the story follows Mia Allen, who arrives at the cabin with her brother David and several friends. She is trying to overcome a heroin addiction, so the group plans to keep her isolated until she completes the withdrawal process. The idea is to prevent her from escaping when the symptoms become worse. However, inside the cellar, they find dead animals and signs that someone had performed a ritual there. They also discover a book wrapped in plastic and barbed wire, accompanied by numerous warnings intended to prevent anyone from opening it. Eric, behaving exactly as a horror film character would, naturally ignores every warning, removes the protections, and begins translating the pages. Eventually, he speaks the incantation aloud. The Kandarian Demon awakens once again and finds Mia in the forest. She is attacked and becomes possessed, but when she tries to warn the others, they all believe she is suffering a psychotic episode caused by withdrawal. This detail is very important to the story because it shows how the evil uses a real problem as an excuse to hide. Mia is telling the truth, but her history of addiction means that nobody trusts her. By the time the others finally understand what is happening, the possession is already spreading. The Necronomicon in this film contains slightly different rules. It explains that a possessed person can be purified through fire, dismemberment, or being buried alive. Because of this, David decides to use the final option on his sister as a method of exorcism. Mia is buried and dies, causing the entity to leave her body. David then digs her up and manages to revive her, using an improvised defibrillator. For a few moments, it seems that they have found a way to deceive the demon, but by then, everyone else has died, and enough blood has already been spilled to fulfill a prophecy from the book. That is why blood begins to rain from the sky, and a creature known as the Abomination emerges. It is a demonic manifestation that takes on Mia's appearance. The creature then pursues her outside the cabin. During the battle, Mia loses a hand, but she manages to use a chainsaw to completely destroy her double. At dawn, the rain stops and Mia walks away alone, while the book remains abandoned on the ground. Although the film was presented as a new version of Evil Dead, nothing in the story requires the original trilogy to be removed from continuity. The explanation involving the different books allows Mia's story to take place within the same universe, using another volume of the Necronomicon Demon and another manifestation of the Kandarian Demon. Years later, Evil Dead Rise reinforced this idea even further. The film begins at a cabin near a lake, where a young woman named Jessica becomes possessed and attacks her friends. However, this scene actually takes place after the main story. The central events begin one day earlier in an apartment building in Los Angeles. Beth, who has just discovered that she is pregnant, goes to visit her sister Ellie. Ellie lives with her 3 children, Danny, Bridget, and Cassie. Ellie is going through a difficult situation. Her husband has abandoned the family, the building where they live is about to be demolished, and she is trying to keep her children together while searching for a new place to live. Then an earthquake opens a fissure beneath the car park. Danny goes down to investigate and discovers an old bank vault buried beneath the building. Inside it, he finds religious objects, several vinyl records, and another volume of the Necronomicon Demon. Danny takes the book and plays the vinyl records. In the recordings, a priest explains that he found the volume in 1923. He also warns that the other members of his church ignored his recommendations and decided to read the words from the book. Despite the warnings, Danny continues playing the audio until he hears the incantation. Once again, the Kandarian Demon awakens. It attacks Ellie inside the lift and then makes her return to the apartment, apparently injured. However, what returns is no longer Ellie. The mother transforms into a Deadite and begins using the family's memories to torment her children. The demon imitates her voice, pretends to be frightened, and even claims that part of her still remains inside the body. Beth understands that her sister can no longer be saved and focuses on protecting the children. But the possession continues to spread. As a result, Bridget becomes infected and attacks Danny. The neighbors are also killed, while the main quarter of the building becomes a trap filled with bodies. After this, Beth attempts to escape with Cassie, but Ellie, Danny, and Bridget eventually merge into a creature composed of several bodies, known as the Marauder. The creature pursues Beth and Cassie into the car park. There, Beth uses a chainsaw and manages to throw it into a wood chipper. The bodies are destroyed, and the 2 survivors manage to leave the building. However, the Kandarian Demon has not disappeared or returned to its dormant state. The following day, Jessica enters the car park after returning from a trip. The entity takes advantage of this opportunity to attack and possess her, causing the massacre at the lake that we saw at the beginning. And it is precisely from that point that Evil Dead Burn begins. 2 men are fishing peacefully when Jessica emerges from the water as a Deadite and kills them. She then walks to a road where she appears to be waiting for a specific person. That person is Will Price. Will is married to Alice, but their relationship is controlling and violent. During the celebration of his brother Joseph's birthday, he feels humiliated, argues with the others, and leaves the gathering completely drunk. While driving at high speed, he runs Jessica over and loses control of the vehicle. The car catches fire and Will becomes trapped. The Deadite then approaches him and says that she needs him to take her to his family. This reveals that the Deadites are no longer attacking completely at random, as they did in the other films, and are now searching for something specific. The Price family possesses something they want. After Will's death, Alice has to reunite with her in-laws during the funeral. There we meet Edgar and Susan, Will's parents, his grandmother Polly, and Joseph and his partner Thea. The family remembers Will as a perfect husband, but Alice knew his abusive side and could not participate in that false version of his life. While his body is being prepared for cremation, Will's burned corpse awakens while possessed and passes the evil to Edgar. The family then travels to an isolated property connected to Will and Joseph's grandfather, the researcher Benjamin Price. Benjamin had belonged to an organization known as the Circle of Wise Men. For years, he studied the Necronomicon, the Deadites, and possible ways of sending them back to their own dimension. Among his discoveries was the Kandarian Dagger, a relic that had already appeared alongside the Necronomicon in the saga, although we do not know whether it is the same one. However, Byrne makes it a central part of the story. According to Benjamin, this weapon could destroy Deadites more effectively than any conventional weapon, so he decided to hide it. Before the funeral, Joseph found his grandfather's recordings and eventually located the dagger. Everything suggests that finding it also allowed the demons to detect its presence. That is why Jessica sought out Will. The entity used him as a kind of Trojan horse to reach his family and find the dagger. During dinner, Edgar completes his transformation. He attacks the others, and the possession begins spreading once again. First the dog, then Thea, and eventually the rest of the family are used by the Deadites while Alice tries to understand what is happening and what they are searching for. Alice discovers Benjamin's research and realizes that her only chance of survival is to find the dagger before the Deadites do. As the entire house fills with blood, she has to fight the possessed bodies of her in-laws, severing limbs and using any object she can find to defend herself. Eventually, Alice manages to recover the Kandarian Dagger. With the weapon in her hands, she can now injure the Deadites far more effectively. However, the house is already completely lost, so Alice starts a fire and allows the building to burn with the creatures inside. For a few moments, it appears that the horror has ended, but then Will appears. His burned corpse returns as a kind of superior Deadite. Will pursues Alice into the area around the crematorium, where construction work is taking place, and uses illusions to manipulate her. He shows her memories of the supposedly happy moments from their marriage, and tries to convince her that something human still remains inside him. But Alice also remembers all the violence, the control, and everything she had to endure while Will was alive. The demon attempts to use exactly the same manipulation techniques that her husband used before he died. Because of this, instead of falling into the trap, Alice takes the dagger and drives it into him, finally destroying the Deadite. Alice survives and keeps the weapon. However, Byrne includes 2 additional scenes demonstrating that, despite the dagger and everything Alice has done, the evil remains active. During the credits, we discover that Polly, the grandmother, managed to escape the fire by amputating her legs. The Deadite drags herself to a road and pretends to be injured when a driver stops to help her. Polly claims that Alice stole her legs, but then looks at the woman and says that hers will do perfectly. The scene ends before the attack, making it clear that the possession will continue spreading and the massacre will go on. The second scene takes place after all the credits. At the crematorium where Will's body was prepared, a worker shows her daughter several urns that were never collected by the families of the deceased. When the girl is left alone, she begins reading the names written on the plaques. Suddenly, she says one of the names aloud, a familiar name, Ellie Bixler, the mother from Evil Dead Rise. After saying it, the girl looks into a mirror, and instead of seeing her own reflection, sees Ellie reflected there. The Deadite emerges behind her, kills her brutally, and looks directly into the camera. She then says the words, "Mummy's back." This means that destroying a Deadite's body does not always eliminate the spirit. We should remember that Ellie was shredded alongside her children, but her essence remained connected either to her remains or to the dimension from which these creatures originate. There could even be a deliberate play on the title, Evil Dead Rise, as though the evil connected to Ellie has the ability to rise again. However, for now the film offers no definitive explanation, so by the end of Evil Dead Burn, Ellie has returned. Polly continues spreading the Deadite infection, and Alice retains the weapon that the demons appear to fear. In some ways, Evil Dead Burn changes the usual structure of the franchise, or at least attempts to move it towards a larger conflict. Previously, each film presented a more or less self-contained story about a group that found a book, awakened the evil, and tried to survive for a single night. But now the Deadites have an objective. They want the Kandarian Dagger. They are willing to travel, use different bodies, and pursue anyone connected to it. Because of this, Alice is no longer simply another survivor. She has now become the guardian of a weapon capable of directly confronting the forces of evil, just as Ash did in his time. Ultimately, Evil Dead may change details and contradict its own scenes, but all of its stories tell essentially the same nightmare. Evil Dead 2 does not erase the first film. It summarizes its events in an altered form, and then continues Ash's story. Evil Dead from 2013 does not replace the original trilogy, but instead introduces another Book of the Dead within the same world. Rise introduces the third volume, and Burn directly connects the newer films through Jessica, Ellie, and the Kandarian Dagger. The books may be different and the rules may change, but the evil within them always acts in the same way. It finds the trauma of its victims, turns it into a weapon, and uses the bodies of the people we love to return once again. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.